To understand the deadliest conflict in human history, we actually have to step back to the exact moment the previous World War ends. In 1919, global leaders gathered to sign the Treaty of Versailles. The stated goal of this document was to ensure permanent, lasting peace across Europe, but the treaty contained Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It dictated that Germany alone had to bear the financial responsibility for all the damages of World War I. France and Britain handed them a bill for $33 billion. In today's money, that's roughly $270 billion. The treaty effectively cornered the German state, linking its entire economic future to an unpayable debt. These terms would eventually anchor the country's descent into chaos, creating the specific pressures that would later destabilize the entire continent. When Germany made its first payment in 1921, the economy buckled. Hyperinflation set in, and the German mark rapidly became practically worthless paper. Look at the scale of the collapse. In Berlin in 1922, a loaf of bread cost 160 marks. By the following year, that exact same loaf cost 200 billion marks. The working class was plunged into ruin. Unemployment skyrocketed, families were left homeless, and starvation crept into the cities. Into this desperation stepped a young political leader named Adolf Hitler. He realized he could harness the distress of the masses by feeding them a scapegoat, blaming the international humiliation on Jewish citizens and socialists. Total economic collapse creates a massive power vacuum. When people are stripped of their livelihoods and their dignity, it becomes remarkably easy for a radical dictator to seize control. Once in total control, Hitler began blatantly violating the Treaty of Versailles. In 1935, the world learned Germany had secretly built a massive military force, complete with an independent air force called the Luftwaffe. In response, a terrified France decided to hide behind a wall. They constructed the Maginot Line, a massive 450-kilometer-long fortification of bunkers along their eastern border. By 1938, Hitler was confident enough to march his army right into neighboring Austria. He took the country without firing a single shot. The local population, thoroughly saturated by Nazi propaganda, lined the streets to cheer his arrival. He then set his sights on Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, desperate to avoid a war at any cost, signed the Munich Agreement. He handed over Czechoslovakian land in exchange for a promise that Hitler would stop expanding. Each concession strengthened the German military position. By trading land for the promise of stability, the Allies provided Hitler with the industrial resources and the confidence required to escalate his ambitions. Hitler needed one more piece to secure his eastern flank: Poland. In 1939, he signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. The two nations secretly agreed to carve Poland up between them. On September 1st, German troops crossed the border. Britain and France finally issued an ultimatum and declared war. Yet they did almost nothing. During a period known as the Phony War, the Allies sat back, expecting a slow, trench-based slog like World War I. They were completely unprepared for Hitler's military strategy, Blitzkrieg or lightning war. It was a heavily mechanized, terrifyingly fast offensive, designed to overwhelm opponents before they even had time to plan a defense. This speed was fueled by a biological secret. German soldiers were heavily dosed with a drug called Pervitin. Today, we know it as crystal meth. It eliminated fatigue, suppressed hunger, and allowed troops to fight day and night without sleep. Using this drug-fueled momentum, the German army entirely bypassed the static French Maginot Line. They simply drove tens of thousands of military vehicles through the Ardennes forest, an area the French considered utterly impassable. The Allies were tactically paralyzed. They were fighting a war of attrition, while the German forces were executing a chemical-fueled sprint. The Ardennes flanking maneuver was devastating. Nearly 400,000 Allied soldiers found themselves entirely surrounded, pinned between the advancing Nazi army and the cold waters of the English Channel at Dunkirk. What followed was the largest military evacuation in history, Operation Dynamo. It required private fishing vessels and common citizens crossing the channel to drag those soldiers off the beaches under heavy enemy fire. They managed to save the men, but they left all their equipment behind. Within weeks, the French forces were broken, and France surrendered to Hitler and his new Italian ally, Benito Mussolini. Dunkirk is remembered for the incredible bravery of the rescue. But strategically, it was a catastrophic defeat. In a matter of weeks, the European continent had been handed over to the Axis powers. By July 1940, the Old World Order had been obliterated. Hitler had seized control of Austria, Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The newly appointed British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, looked across the Channel at a stark reality. The British Empire now stood entirely alone against the absolute greatest war machine the world had ever seen. The conflict took shape through a sequence of specific failures: a debt-laden peace treaty that crushed the German economy, the repeated political retreats at Munich and Vienna, and a military mindset that couldn't comprehend the speed of mechanized warfare. World War II stands as the logical, devastating climax of this chain reaction.